Our next speaker has been practicing DA for over a decade. In that time, he has been part of 2 award-winning teams at Unilever and at Eli Lilly. He recently left Lilly and started his own company, focused on advising decision expertise groups in the pharmaceutical industry. Please welcome with his case study presentation, Self-Serve Multi-Use Decision Frameworks. Tyler.
Thank you. And kudos, Bill, on the technical issues, dealing with them.
Yeah.
Not the funnest situation.
Yeah, not fun.
So as the title slide says, I've got a case study to try and tell a story here. I do got a couple just setup slides to define what I'm meaning by this self-service multi-use framework thing. So historically in the society at DAG, we've heard before presentations, discussions about essentially a full-blown facilitated DA process, and in another camp, the idea of some sort of embedded DA system. And what I'd like to do is just stretch that thinking a little bit and say, if I plotted those both on 2 dimensions, one, how much facilitator time from a decision professional it takes to actually reach the decision versus how much development times to kind of create the tool that actually helps to get to the decision. I think those 2 buckets span like this. And essentially with the framework thing that I'm talking about, it sits down here. One quick note, this is what a decision tree, at least in my world, at least in pharma, not frequently looks like, right? You've got a decision that you're facing, followed by a number of uncertainties, and you're trying to, before you know how those resolve, you're trying to make a choice. These frameworks are kind of similar, but a little different, and I would just essentially flip it. And what you're doing is saying, we want to develop some sort of tool or structure that's going to fit for a lot of different scenarios they're going to walk through the door eventually. And so those are kind of the uncertainties that sit before. But the framework is going to help us get to essentially a pre-decided decision given whatever conditions or context we find ourselves in. At this particular company, just to give a little bit of context of how important this is to the organization, there is an SVP, a Senior Vice President of Quality. They sit on the executive committee of the company. So this quality issue runs very high, very deep. If you run down, there was a small sub-team that dealt with specifically doing quality assessments on potential third-party partners who were taking over a little piece or a little chunk of that clinical trial or clinical research program. Those assessments that they did, this is sort of the context that they sat in. It was a very risk-averse environment. The basic view of folks is, hey, if something goes wrong down the road with that supplier, it's because it's quality's fault. Because if we had done a better assessment on them, either we would have had better risk mitigation strategies in place, or we would have picked a different company to work with. And the sort of what that did in the culture, it meant that as quality assessed more and they did their full assessment on every single potential supplier that came through, well, then that mean that the rest of the business who was wanting to work with these folks, they said, oh, well, if something does go wrong, it really is quality's fault because they were doing this whole thorough thing and blah, blah, blah. So it was this vicious circle that essentially happened, leading to a point where the business, as quality would refer to it, right, the folks who were actually wanting to work with these people, they, instead of doing much due diligence at all, they would just chuck over a possible partner over to quality and look for them to approve them. And I put approve in quotes because quality felt that technically they weren't approving anybody. They were just assessing them, and it was the business's choice whether to go forward or not. So pretty dysfunctional. And at the very bottom, you see that these are about 2 to 3 assessment requests per week, and they were taking 4 to 6 months to complete, which is lengthy, very lengthy, right? Just for permission to work with someone. So at some point, a group of VPs got together and said, this isn't working. We've got to change it. They tried an approach. The proposal of that approach, essentially the reaction was, hey, that essentially looks like rearranging the deck chairs. I threw one quote up there. There was one of the VPs who said, that proposal makes me want to vomit all over it. No buy-in. So it was actually one of his employees, a former colleague, who reached out and said she had in her mind something that she was calling a risk-based approach, which meant essentially she was saying, gosh, if it's not that big of a deal what a potential third party is doing, can't we do this faster? Leave the full-blown for when it's a bigger deal. And that was her basic premise. So we worked together to essentially create to apply some DADQ to this context and come up with a framework. That started with me trying to distill and define what the main objective was, It's the sentence there in orange at the bottom. Essentially, while ensuring no undue risk exposure to the company, we wanted to assess potential third parties as quickly as possible. You'll see at the bottom right across to that values piece, that was kind of the key trade-offs, is the speed by which these got assessed versus the risk exposure that the company was getting into. The decision in all of this was essentially what type of assessment to do on a proposed third party. When we started the project, they essentially had two. They could do it face-to-face, or they could do it virtually, which just kind of meant picking up the phone, but still going over the full same thing. So from here, as we started working, I said, well, let me try out a bit of a frame shift here. And I said, what if instead of thinking of we start with the full-blown assessment and then we reason why maybe it might not have to do the whole thing, what if we flipped that on its head and said, let's start with no assessment as a starting place and reason and justify why you got to do it. And so we had a group of about a dozen folks in a room, and I just said, hey, look, imagine that some third party has just been approved to work with, and there was absolutely no assessment done. What are the top, few things that are going to keep you up at night? And amongst that discussion, we distilled it to about 12 to 15 different risks, depending on how, they're all interrelated, so depending on how you combined or split hairs between them, a little over a dozen major concerns that these folks had. And so then the question was, well, how do you assess them? And on the left, the simplest way, at least to accomplish that assessment, would be to do one risk at a time. And they said, well, that doesn't quite work, because lots of times the answer would be, well, it depends. There's some of these really are very interrelated. In fact, technically, they're all interrelated, which would be the very far right, some sort of 15-dimensional assessment, which obviously is just not a humanly thinkable process to do. So we settled on this one in the middle that I labeled practical, which was essentially that we put the risks in groups, whatever made sense. So sometimes it was 5 or 6 risks, and sometimes it was just 1 or 2. And then we assessed the risk group by group. And so that's what I'll show you. And so what I have coming up next is essentially several different techniques to assess a group of risks at a time. And again, the decision was about what type of assessment to give. And so one change that we made early on before we got into dealing with the risk was to say, let's introduce a new alternative. So there was still the face-to-face and the virtual, but now we talked about, hey, what if just going through this framework was viewed as an initial assessment? And if they were low enough risk, you might not need to do anything more. And so that was this initial only. So you'll see that on the slides that I flip through in a minute, which are the actual tool, they all come to an end point of one of these options, given the conditions. Are you doing an initial, a virtual, or a face-to-face? And I mentioned doing different groupings of risks. The idea was we went through all the groups, and the final answer was whatever the most conservative option was. So if you had one face-to-face, then you did a face-to-face. If everything was at virtual, then you did a virtual. Whatever the worst one was, that was how you reacted in the end. So first technique that I'm showing is what I'm calling a condition tree. It's actually kind of similar to when I showed the decisions and the uncertainties swapped in essence. So this grouping of risks, 3 different risks here, we labeled these systems and procedures. It looks a whole lot like a decision tree, but there's not a decision node on there. The decision is essentially at the end. So the idea here is that, well, the only place where any further assessment was needed was if you were working with a third party. That third party was working in the company's IT system. The third party was based off-site, and they were working adhering to their own SOPs. That was the perceived somewhat risky situation that would need a virtual assessment. Any other path or set of conditions, they landed in this initial only, which it doesn't look like rocket science here, but culturally that was a huge shift because they were originally starting from full-blown every time, all the time. And we were able to help identify conditions in which it was the opposite. Just this framework was enough. So this one, I'll go through it, skip past it somewhat quickly because it's essentially a decision tree, but just with different conditions on uncertainties. The next one is a spectrum. I tend to use this quite a bit and find that it tends to unlock it's not rocket science, but just simple thinking in people's minds. So there was another grouping of risks that came up. These are kind of in the words of the folks who stated them. Hey, something, if there's got anything to do with needles, that's a big deal to us. That would be something of risk. This adverse event discovery in pharma, that is that chance of maybe finding out that something had gone wrong with a patient. They had experienced what we call an adverse event, heart attack, stroke, something significant. Employees at drug companies actually get training on how to, if they heard about that even at a party or at DAG or something, you've got to report it. It's a huge deal within the industry. So that the potential of a third party accidentally stumbling on and hearing about some of those would be a big issue. So we looked at these, and instead of using a tree to kind of separate them out, the intention here was to combine them. So we said, well, the most extreme way that you can interact with a patient is to simply poke and prod them, drawing blood, giving them something. Anytime you're using a needle and actually, interfacing with that human body, that was pretty extreme. And the group that I was working with said, well, I asked about, what about, one step below that? They said, well, actually, hey, even if you were just developing essentially guidelines or protocol that would include that picking and poking, that would be significant. So I said, okay, well, let's talk about this idea of adverse event discovery. And so we said, well, essentially, it's all about how they interact with patients. If this third party in their interaction with patients, they're asking only scripted questions, then that's fair. That's much lower risk. But if they're asking either open-ended questions or if it's just an unscripted discussion, then it introduces a higher potential for these things for a patient to share, oh, I had this happen to me. And that was a significant risk. And the third, on clinical endpoints, means that their questioning of their discussions with the patient led to a metric that was important to define success or failure of the study. So that's a big deal, and was placed here. And so all we did on this was add one more on the very far end and said, hey, well, what if you're not interacting with patients at all? That's probably the extreme to the left. And from there, we go back to the same sort of, well, which of the three alternatives, where do you start to draw the line in between? And I think this is where the power of the spectrum, simple as it is, just to allow people to start to draw a line and a threshold. And so what they came up with was, hey, obviously from the far left, we start with no further assessment. How far can you march to the right before you feel like you'd have to change, do some sort of assessment? And they kind of got to this, and there was some prompting and discussion about, would you ever need a face-to-face given these risks? And with some pushing and prodding, they said no. So again, this was a huge thing to get to culturally. Final one is sort of a combination, so multiple step here. So we'll start with the spectrum again. This time we took sensitivity of data. So this is around data access and storage. And so I said, well, what do you mean by that? What's going on with when you say sensitivity of data? Essentially, I said, well, data can come in two buckets. Either it's it's data about individuals, or it's data about the company. And those two, the black is the safe data, the orange is the riskier data. If it's de-identified about an individual, or if it's publicly available about the company, we're on safe ground. If it's sensitive personal information or confidential information, then that's an issue. So I said, in my mind I'm thinking, this is a simple spread, these two buckets, right? But then as we're discussing further, like, whoa, wait a minute, actually there's a difference, because that's just what the data, when it's provided to us as an entity or the company, right? They said, well, there's also the type of data that the third party is actually collecting or storing. So they could be doing the same sort of thing. They could be collecting or storing de-identified data, or personal or publicly available or confidential. So we said, okay, great. Now we're still in these two buckets, right? Either you're safe or you're not. We said, well, once you have the two levels, the two layers though, there's actually a third option that shows up in between, where you're collecting the confidential, but then you're sharing back to the company de-identified. So now we've got three buckets. And I started to go back to, now how would we behave in each of these? And then we detangled, well, actually there's something else. It also depends on what the business model of that third party is. Why are they collecting the data? Are they doing it regardless of us? Is it part of what they do naturally for all sorts of folks? Or are they doing it specifically for us? So you'll say, I put those at the two far ends. And as soon as you add this extra dimension, obviously then the one in the middle can split again as well. And they could do it, regardless or specifically for the company. So in total, after all this discussion, we ended up with 4 different buckets. And again, what do? Initial, virtual, or face-to-face. So we started with initial on the left and said, how far can you go? And this is what they came up with was, hey, the two on the left, we'd be good. That's safe enough just to know the detail where we're at. The ones on the right, we'd have to split down and get into a few more things. It depends on a couple other dimensions, some of the other bubbles up at the top. But what was identified was that both of those right-hand ones have the same sort of starting condition. You're collecting this private or sensitive data, and you're doing it specifically for the company. So if you take that and that's now in that square on the left-hand side is the starting place. Essentially, we started laying on the other risks. So this is a condition tree like we saw before, right? Just splitting out the different ways that it might go. And so essentially here, this was about, hey, where are you storing the data? Is it on-site or off-site? If it's over at the third party, are they doing it in a certified data center that's looking good? If it was either on-site at the company or at a data center that was certified, less risky. That's the black. You're going to go to a matrix A. More risky if it's not in those conditions. And so this is what I mean by a matrix. So this just simply shows the other two risks, the amount of data and how the privacy level, how sensitive that was. And so these two little simple, the company had very defined, very robust definitions for low, medium, and high on the privacy levels. So that was easy. We just piggybacked on that. But then we had to give them some sort of thresholds to talk about, well, if it's a little bit of data, even if it is more sensitive, like we could actually be okay with that. It's only when they start having a whole lot of it. And so what we found was that this ability to be able to essentially say, using that spectrum to get to this is the only condition that we worry more about, to then split out and detangle those ones, allowed folks mentally to be down to just 2 dimensions that they were dealing with in that matrix and assess it and say, well, if we were in that square, this is how we would behave. And that's that game of being able to say, you know, how many of these depend on one another? Let's assess them at the same time. I have one more, but I'll skip it for time. It's essentially a similar sort of thing, being able to detangle different buckets, create those buckets. Some are riskier than others. Take that dimension of which bucket, kind of risky bucket you're in, spread it across now a 3-dimensional matrix, where one dimension is the bucket from the previous tree slide, and then a series of matrices here. So you could view these as layered on top of one another as a 3-dimensional sort of matrix. In terms of being able to view it and work with it, we just split it out as 4 different things. And pictorially, that has really worked with people's minds. Like with the team, they could quite easily remember the condition they were in, look at the colors, and be able to kind of make sure that as they moved up in risk, that they were responding accordingly, so to speak. It allowed it to not only be developed pretty simply, but when it was deployed, this was done by the quality group having a weekly meeting. These teams that were proposing a third party would come in, and as a group, they would go through a slide deck that was somewhat similar to this, and would walk it through, and they'd decide as a group where they landed, fully transparent all the way through. And it was really interesting because what was taken 4 to 6 months on average, I participated in the first few of these just to kind of help with the process. And we walked out one time with a gentleman that I knew, who was a senior leader. He kind of came as like going to bring a little oomph to kind of get my way with this quality group. We walked out of the room, and they ended up in this initial only bucket. And he says, so what do I do now? And I said, well, that's it, you're done. Like, that's the assessment. And he's, really? Yeah, that was it. That was the assessment. That was all you needed. And he was like, oh. And so what was previously taken, 4 to 6 months, it was done in, 15 minutes. So not all the time, right? Appropriately. So anyway, it was a fantastic opportunity, and the folks have run that, and they continue to run it on their own without any decision professional intervening, built soundly, but run by them. So
we are in a, thank you.
Yeah.
We are in a bit of a crunch because of the confusion. We got started a couple minutes late. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. I told Somak he started us 5 minutes late by switching the rooms. He pays the price. So, is there a question for Tyler?
It is Friday at whatever it is, 4:15. Stuart.
Tyler, this kind of lends itself to an automated. This kind of lends itself to an automated tool and interface at the end where they're just entering these things, and there's rules behind the scenes that are categorizing it and spitting it out. How sophisticated was the final product with respect to that kind of that level of visualization?
Right. So I've worked with a couple other folks who have gone more robust. This group, it just stayed at a PowerPoint slide deck. What they did was create an Excel spreadsheet that tracked the answers on each. So then they had a data repository that they could look at summary statistics, this, that, and the other. But to your point, not only did the guide help them have the proper, robust discussion, but it was documentation of why they had decided the way they did. And so that was huge, to be able to communicate that.
Any other questions?
beyond the tool itself, I wonder how is the group operating compared to some of your earlier comments around people felt that quality was on the hook for something that quality didn't feel like they were on the hook, and there was that ratchet effect on the guidelines themselves.
Right, yeah. On the quality side, these people were really kind of steeped in their process. It's taken time to kind of shift that culture. But I would say their reputation in the business has significantly changed. They had essentially some groups in the business were constant users of their assessment process. And so those people in particular were just like, they started to say, this is great, so helpful, like you're a business partner now, rather than this horrible hurdle that we've got to get through. So that part was fast and quick to change. Yeah, yeah. Thank you.